Thanks. At State Street, over the past few years, we've been on a mission to strategically transform how we perform financial monitoring, particularly with regard to anti-money laundering transaction monitoring. And over a year ago, we actually shifted from a rules-based approach to a machine learning model-based approach. We've had a lot of success with it. So although my presentation is around challenges, I do want to start out with the benefits and the reason why we do this in the first place. We've seen our false positive rate go down about half. It's still high, but we've seen it go down significantly. We've also seen our escalation rates improve, and this means of the alerts that we create, telling our investigators to look deeper into particular activity. When they do that, they're finding more reason to deepen the investigation, meaning that the alerts that they're receiving are of higher quality. We've also been able to identify new risks. Part of this is around automating our procedures end to end, our systemic approach, so that things that would previously have only been identified manually, meaning no guarantee that they're identified, they're pulled in, but also through unsupervised machine learning, we're able to identify statistical outliers that are worthy of exploration in specific investigations, but also for upgrading our models or expanding them in the future. We'll talk about that a bit more in a couple minutes. And then finally, in conjunction with entity resolution and network generation, which I would say it's not worth doing machine learning unless you're also incorporating that type of logic. We've seen capability increase significantly so that our investigators can spend a lot less time going through the information that we present to them. So that's why we're doing all of this. But today I want to get into some of the challenges and lessons learned along the way as well. Can we go to the next slide, please? So we have focused our efforts on supervised machine learning. We use suspicious activity reporting, or SARs, as our target. Those are previous regulatory filings that highlight specific risks that we've either developed into scenarios on our own or our regulators have told us we have to look at. So that source of data is the best source, but it has a lot of problems as well because the past is based primarily on rules-based approaches. So as we move forward with our machine learning, that data will get better. Of course, we're going to have to update our models to address that. But the models that we initially went live really relied upon data that's essentially from a previous regime. Also, anyone who works in the financial sector, which is very heavily regulated, knows that there's a lot of pressure to indicate anything that could potentially be suspicious activity for financial monitoring. So there's also a question of, there might be a lot of SARs out there that really don't pinpoint risk because of a conservative compliance perspective. So that's another thing that's really hard to control for and makes that problematic in some ways as a target. So I think the answer there is we'll get better data as we move forward, but for now we need to take that into account. There are other issues that really just apply to machine learning across the board. They're not particular to financial monitoring, but they may have specific permutations. So one, of course, is the whole black box issue. There is that perception that it's difficult to explain why something is an output of a model. We've actually had pretty good luck here working with our model validation team and hand in hand with regulators to show what the inputs of our models are, what algorithms we use, and then what outputs come the other side. But we also had to do extensive due diligence to compare our rules-based approach previously to our machine learning approach now and show that we're not uncovering fewer risks than we did before. And actually, we have a better risk profile now, but we had to go through a fairly onerous attempt to compare what really are apples and oranges. So that, I think, is a continuing pressure that we'll face as we migrate other financial monitoring to the machine learning approach. There's also data drift. As I mentioned before, our initial models were really based on a prior regime. And we've seen that our underlying data sets are very dynamic. So that's something that anyone building models has to take care of. So that's not unique. But because we're heavily regulated and we don't have the ability to change models quickly in response to the data, it has to go through a pretty rigid approach. That means that in between the ability to retrain or update our models, our model output can get further and further away from the underlying data. So I think in the future, when the regulatory approach to machine learning models is more solidified, we'll probably get more flexibility around that model management, but it's definitely something we have to keep a very sharp eye on now. And also, there's a perception out there, again, not exclusive to financial monitoring sector, but around biases that can be introduced in machine learning rules. Now, the of AML data and financial monitoring data, I don't think lends itself readily to gender or racial biases, although as responsible practitioners, we should always be aware of the possibilities and look out for it. I think with regard to financial monitoring, the concerns are probably more around socioeconomic biases potentially. For example, there are certain financial services that are used more often to serve people in a lower socioeconomic strata. And so I think that might be something that we want to keep an eye on, that we're not prejudiced against them. One possible example that comes to mind is money services businesses. Those are subject to very strict regulatory oversight, and they tend to disproportionately serve lower socioeconomic strata. So just something to keep in mind around this whole development of the sector. And then finally, we have constant turnover of our data scientists and modelers. And I think, again, not exclusive to us. I think everybody's facing this. There's just such a demand for these people, but it really emphasizes, especially when we have to meet rigid regulatory expectations, that it's really important to have discipline around how your models are documented and executed, so that even in the face of a lot of turnover, your processes are clear and defensible, and they can continue to operate without serious challenges. Next slide, please. Now getting a little bit more into the regulatory aspect, and if you're in a room with compliance people, this is definitely something that we talk about all the time because it's just so ever present in what we do every day. First, I want to talk about aspects around model validation that are pretty specific to the financial sector. And again, this reflects very high regulatory scrutiny. I mean, I think people understand that because the financial sector is the backbone of the economy, and it has a lot of influence on people's prosperity. So it's understandable why there's a high level of regulation. Nonetheless, it does create some challenges. Specifically, as I was referencing before, our data sets tend to be very dynamic, meaning we have to ensure that we're retraining our models whenever we see the data drifting significantly from the data that we used to create the models in the first place. But we don't really have the flexibility, at least at this point in time, to tune or retrain our models on an ongoing basis. We have to go through a pretty structured model validation process, which is designed to meet regulatory requirements and was originally really supporting rules-based approaches that are a lot simpler. So that is, I'd say, a constant source of concern when we're trying to get the most out of these models. So again, going forward, we're going to look for the model lifecycle management to get more routine, more disciplined, and easier to explain. And I think we can really enhance that part of the process. But right now we're still in the beginnings, I would say. The other aspect that's really challenging, and this is not unique to machine learning, but it has a huge impact because everything, or not everything, but a lot is about of our success. It has to do with how we use the data that we have to create models, and what algorithms we choose to most accurately reflect the significance of features in the model. Uh, so in terms of financial monitoring, some real tension. On the one hand, there's the expectation that we leverage all internal bank data sources, which anyone who has worked in a large corporation probably knows there's a whole bunch of different legacy systems, different quality, different accessibility. Plus, we're expected to bring in third-party sources that give us more information, for example, around who actually owns a business or who's behind a financial institution that we interact with. So that's a lot of data to reconcile all together. At the same time, the restrictions on what data can be shared across borders is changing, and in many cases becoming stricter. So while we're supposed to know every time we interact with a certain customer, there are also some limitations, both practical and systemic on one hand, and regulatory and legal on the other, that make that difficult. And this all feeds into the issue around entity resolution and network generation. Again, I don't think it's even worth going forward without enhancing entity resolution, because it enables the identification of important connections. First, that you know who you're dealing with, because entities can have multiple names, multiple corporate structures, multiple jurisdictions, and then when we put that into network identification as well, where we can see that entities that may appear to be above board are actually closely linked to other entities that are not. And this is really important to make the most of whatever data you have. So all this pulls together, and that's also dependent upon those data sources that go into it. So it's very complex, cross-cutting tensions. You just have to manage it on an ongoing basis to be effective. Next slide, please. Now, as I mentioned at the beginning, we've made a lot of progress in our transformation from rules-based to machine learning-based monitoring, but there's still so far to go. And to support that, I think there are different aspects. One is the regulatory aspect. There's been a lot of support for regulators around the globe to leverage new and innovative technologies. So that's, I think, a really positive thing. But as with any new technology, there is inconsistent momentum forward, and it can be difficult to get clarity. So it's really important that we work with our regulators to try to ensure that we focus on things that are actually risky, and that's related to data analysis, which is a real break from the past in financial monitoring, where risks are definitely defined subjectively. So that has aspects of both regulatory nature, but then also how we identify relevant data and use techniques and tools effectively to pull the most value out of it. So those are two areas that we must continue to really push in order to make progress. And then I would also just emphasize, there's an incremental nature to this. That is typical when there's a lot of regulation, because each step you go, you do have to demonstrate that you're not losing any of the value of the previous system. It's inherently conservative. So while that can be challenging and involve a lot of bureaucracy, both internal to a firm and in engaging with regulators and auditors outside of it, you need to keep up the pressure and the momentum. So even if some of the gains are more incremental than you want them to be, that's how we ultimately move this sector forward in the direction that I've been talking about. Next slide, please. I also wanted to talk about some other challenges that I'd say maybe are not really affecting us now, but are definitely on the horizon, and we need to be thinking about in the financial sector. So one is blockchain. That's probably not unexpected to have it here. There are a lot of major financial institutions that are working hard to build out their digital asset capabilities, and the bank I represent, State Street, is certainly one of them. Blockchain is really a very different type of technology in terms of processing and storing data. So everything from beginning to end of how we process data typically today has to be rethought with regard to blockchain. And some things will be easier around identification of entities, but some things are just going to be really hard for us to process systemically. So we'll have to think very carefully around how we pull that type of data into our models. And similarly, there's going to be the expectation to look at different types of data going forward, particularly open source intelligence, as it's called. Right now, we really rely on data we collect ourselves in the bank, and really third-party data providers who have very stellar reputations around their data gathering capabilities. But there's more and more recognition that there's a lot of information out there that could be relevant to investigations that is not structured. It could be images, it could be social media, it could be a lot of things. So that's really going to challenge our abilities in the future to pull in data, reconcile it, figure out what's worthwhile and what's not, and then use those in our models. And then finally, today, particularly with regard to anti-money laundering, it's very retrospective, looking at historical patterns, whereas with the addition of more data, better models, better outputs, I think there's going to be a lot of pressure to increase the cycle. A lot of institutions monitor basically on a monthly basis now, and I think that over time we're going to see that decrease in terms of the periodicity. So, maybe going to weekly and then to daily, and ultimately ending up at real time. And that just increases exponentially the scaling and processing needs that are required. So really big technical challenges that are coming with us, and or that we're going to see. And then, of course, every type of challenge we see, whether it's risk-based, operational-based, or technical-based, we're going to have to interpret that, explain it to our regulators, work with regulators to incorporate it effectively into the regulatory regime. So that's a lot of work ahead of us. Next slide, please. Finally, I wanted to leave with some, or at least finish my portion of the presentation with some thoughts about what we can do, what we should do, how we can and should be engaged around these issues. First, just echoing some of the comments I've made during this presentation. Right now, the regulatory regime with regard to the use of machine learning and artificial intelligence, optical character recognition, natural language processing, robotic process automation. I mean, there are a whole bunch of innovative techniques that are increasingly being used. The regulatory approach is really not settled. So that means that those of us who are pushing forward in this area sooner have more burden to show that it's effective, especially compared to previous approaches. Um, but we also have a really interesting opportunity to prove out how things can be different and better. And so I would say that it's really important to work very closely with regulators to jointly define how the regulatory regime is going to be applied. Now, obviously, it's the province of the government to define exactly what the regulations and laws will be, but it's up to practitioners to define the use cases and demonstrate how we can and should do things differently, and that's a very critical input into the regulatory process. Related to that is, just emphasizing what's at stake here. And I've referenced two areas where this really has an impact, the cost and the technology. So in terms of cost, we spend a lot of money on compliance of various types, but in particular with financial monitoring, where we tend to process a lot of information and as a result of that, look at a lot of data, probably more closely than, or not probably, definitely more closely than is really warranted, because we have such high false positive rates of models, even now when we've made good strides forward. So what that translates into at the end of the day, high costs for our banks, our shareholders, and essentially a tax on the financial sector as a whole, because it's essentially the cost of entry in order to operate in this sector, which means that it creates a barrier for people to access financial services. So that should be a really strong motivator for us to do things differently. And side by side with that is the idea that new technologies can really they're an incredible opportunity to do things better. And certainly machine learning is one of them, where we can direct our attention systemically and otherwise to things that matter, things that truly represent risks to the bank, to our clients, to the financial sector, and identify more effectively criminal activity that threatens all of that. But as always, when you're pushing something new, it takes a lot of effort to overcome the inertia, the general resistance to change. So I would just want to really emphasize these points, that it's worth moving in this direction. It takes a lot of work. It takes a lot of care in how we go about it. But there's a lot at stake here for the good. All right, I wanted to stop